I think that's when we learn as young gay kids to begin to internalize our differences.
Yes.
And that's where those differences sit for a while, and then they start to become shame.
Yes.
And then we start to think of different ways to cover ourselves, and we begin to walk a fake journey and bury our authenticity.
Yes, Margaret.
Welcome to the Solar Wilson Conversation. This is a forum where we share our views through the lens of a Nigerian, lesbian, legally married couple. I am Margaret Solar Wilson.
And I am Moji Solar Wilson.
Moji and I believe in and are committed to creating space for real, authentic, transparent, and inclusive conversation. We talk with each other and we talk with others. So sit back, because it's time for real talk. Moji, another day, another conversation. How are you?
I am absolutely fantastic.
Great.
And you?
I'm doing great. I was just thinking, we've spent a lot of time talking about our mothers, talking about our fathers. It takes me back, all the way back to growing up. And we have talked in the past, you and me, right, about growing up and feeling different.
Yeah.
What did it feel like for you growing up, and why do you say you felt different when you were growing up as a child in Nigeria?
I mean, growing up and feeling different I thought was normal, really. I thought everybody felt different because, we all kind of had different setups. In those days, everything was about value and integrity and all that. So what most people presented on the outside, I now know, is not what is really going on in their homes. It's hysterical talking to other people and finding out that sometimes they had the same experience that I did. When I met you, we had many hours of conversations because we had so much in common growing up. One of the biggest things I remember was the revolving door my father had at his front door, where women just came in and they left, and they came and they left. That was a very weird thing because in those days, you were not allowed, or you were not thought of, because that was right after Nigeria became independent. And most people were trying to be Europeanized. The Europeans had one wife, one father, and then you have my dad with God knows how many wives and how many girlfriends. And it was normal to me. I didn't really explore the world as in the outside world. Like most kids go to their uncle's house, and then I only went to one uncle's house and one auntie's house. That's all I was allowed to really do. And I spent most of my childhood anyways in boarding schools. And you?
It's interesting you say that, right? So we go back to our origin family. And as I listened to you, I remember I felt different because I just assumed that everybody had an intact family around me. And I knew that my father had left, and it was just my brother, my mother, and I living at home. I felt so different. I guarded that as a secret.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember my friends would come to the house and they'd say, "Where's your dad?" And I would say, "He's gone out." I would never say he doesn't live here. And I guarded that secret for years. In fact, many of my friends didn't realize that my father was not in the home because I built all these stories around it. He'd either traveled or he'd gone out. I felt like I was the only one.
Right.
And it was fascinating when I grew older and I found out that many of my friends were being raised by single mothers.
Yeah.
But like me, they had just guarded that secret. So I don't know, that piece, I did feel different. But I think if there had been more transparency around discussions, and if our society had been more open-minded, I wouldn't have felt that different.
I actually agree with you because honestly, the more people I spoke to as I started to hang around Nigerians, the more I realized that, yeah, this single mother phenomenon has been around. And even people that had husbands, and I'm putting up my fingers here, they still were single mothers because their husbands were not really involved in the raising piece. They were involved in being a disciplinarian. But the basic everyday talking to and nurturing and things like that was placed on most mothers in our culture. So, and then when you add the piece of the different cultures that my stepmothers came from, it was it was the wildest thing. Now I look at it as a very exciting and enlightening time. But back then it was very painful because, we were not even allowed to speak Yoruba in our home because of the different languages. So the common language in our home was English. So if you spoke Yoruba, you had to put money in a jar. You had to put some of your pocket money in a jar. Did you guys do that in your house as well?
No, we didn't. In my house, we had no choice but to speak English because my father came from one part of the country. Mm-hmm. My mother came from another.
Yeah.
And so they didn't speak each other's languages fluently. They understood a couple of words here and there. So the common unifying language was English. We had no choice but to speak it. But it's interesting, though, that language also made me feel different.
Right.
Because when I listen to your story, I think, wow, that must have been fascinating. To have people in the household who spoke different languages, it was okay to speak different languages. Because that's another area where I felt different. So I grew up in the western part of Nigeria where the language is Yoruba. And there was this expectation from everyone around that you had to speak that language. People just assumed that was your language. And if you didn't understand it, or if you had a different language, then it was pretty isolating because there were not a lot of people in the western part of the country, Lagos, where I grew up, Ibadan. There were many people actually who spoke different languages, but for some reason, and that's because Yoruba is the sort of native language of Lagos, it all revolved around that. So growing up as a child in that part of the country and not speaking the language then, I did feel very, very different.
Yeah. The language piece is a big thing because when you think about the fact that as a young child, I'm in a home with houseboys and housegirls from different parts of Nigeria, and you never know when they're talking about you, right? You never know what they're talking about. So one of my biggest things was to learn words, right? I can't speak Hausa, but I can say hello, good morning. I can say Daulo. I think that's Igbo. And a few other little words all over the place. But even the food, that's one of the reasons why I can eat anything. Because when a stepmother comes in and she's from, let's say, Calabar, I eat whatever she cooks or whatever she tells the houseboy or the chef or whatever is around then, I eat that. So when I came to the United States, trying new foods was not, a problem for me. As you know, I eat anything, anywhere, at least I'll try it once. But growing up with different stepmothers was what would be considered traumatic in 2023. For me, it was just normal. And then when you go back to school, to boarding school, right? Boarding school was actually my normal space because we were all kids whose parents at whatever age decided they should be semi-adults, right? In training, I should say, adults in training. And that on its own was a different monster by itself because when you think about the fact that I felt different, because a lot of you were expected to be with boys and I was not really attracted to boys. So I had a lot of friends but people didn't know we were not dating. They just see me with these guys. My best friend was my cousin, my first cousin. My best friends have always been guys, as you know, till today. And for a long time, I thought there was something wrong with me. And then I started meeting girls in boarding school that kind of sort of were like me, but not really. It was crazy. And yours?
School was school was another place where I felt very different. I felt very different, one, because I was, for a number of reasons, I was much younger than my peers in the same class. And that's kind of what happens when you switch countries. In grade school, I ended up much younger than my peers. So that was the first area of difference. And then I began to realize, like you, that our interests were really different. You get to an age where, young girls begin to talk about young boys, right? And have crushes on young boys. And I just couldn't understand that phenomenon. I mean, I could understand it, but it just wasn't the way I felt, right? And I was having crushes on girls. It was very, very confusing, and I felt so different. Again, you quickly realize that you can't really speak or ask about those differences because you get signals from around you that you are supposed to be that way, and if you're not that way, whatever that is, then there's something wrong with you. And so I think that's when we learn as young gay kids to begin to internalize our differences. Yes. And that's where those differences sit for a while, and then they start to become shame.
Yes.
And then we start to think of different ways to cover ourselves, and we begin to walk a fake journey and bury our authenticity.
Yes, Margaret. I think honestly for me, I built this ability to live in two different, sometimes three different worlds, right? Because I remember I must have been like 10. And at 10 years old back then, you were not even allowed to talk about boys, let alone girls. And the funny thing is, it was okay to have girlfriends, friends that were girls. So I would hang out with my friends that were girls until I found somebody that I felt something for. But I didn't understand what it meant because nobody's thinking about sexuality and all that. There wasn't even a name for the disease I thought I had, right? And I thought for a long time that if I just prayed enough, at that young age, if I prayed enough, if I went to church enough, everything was going to be okay. And I'll wake up one day and boom, I would like boys. I like boys. I like men. It's just not in a romantic, sexual, you can have a connection with a human being, but it's not that romantic, erotic attraction. So I would feel that way about a young girl. I remember the first girl I had a crush on. Oh my God. She literally, I would fetch her water. I would make sure she got her lunch, but I didn't understand what it was. And, but as I got older and I started to look around me, and the senior girls had their best friends. And then their best friends you'll find them in compromising positions on their bunk beds and things like that. Okay. My antennas started to open up, and then I had my first relationship. I think I was 12 or so in boarding school. But she had a crush on somebody else in public, but she was my girlfriend, if that makes any sense. Nobody was having sex at that age, but we did things together and all that. What was your experience like?
Actually listening to you causes me to really think about what growing up different does to us. So a couple of times in your conversation, you've had to reassure the listeners that you like boys or you like men, but I just don't like them like that. And it got me thinking of, that's what we have learned to do when we live different.
Yes.
We live a life of having to reassure people. So think about a situation where you say you like dogs. You don't then have to say, I like horses and zebras, but I just don't like them like I like dogs, right? And there's something about, I picked up on that because I do that as well. I picked up on that because it's interesting how growing up different, let me make that a question. Does growing up different make us people pleasers?
Of course it does. Are you kidding me? Of course it does. Growing up different, I'll speak about myself. It made me pander a lot. It made me want to be liked and accepted. Because society indirectly tells you you're not normal. So I wanted to be normal. My dad didn't even go to church. My dad was one of those people, if a imam comes, he would pray with them. He knew all the Muslim prayers. My mother is a Muslim, you know that. If a Christian comes and they want to pray for him, they can go right ahead. If a Babalawo comes and says, hey, I want to pray for you, he'll go with the flow. But I sought out Christianity because in school, that's what was being pushed. And there's no way that even that when you're different, that you don't want to fit in at a particular age. It wasn't until I got older, and we're talking about close to 40 here, that I said, I couldn't do it anymore. But you find yourself lying to cover things, and then you have to lie to cover that lie. And that's one of the reasons why I'm very outspoken these days, because I spent most of my life trying to cover what I thought was a disease or an abnormality. Pandering is part of the symptoms of being different. Most people that are different, we overplease, we overdo, we just want to serve just to be accepted.
Yeah, so it all sort of, it leans towards that need that we all have to belong.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really fascinating. And it's almost as though, at least for me, I had to walk the journey of understanding that I felt different and then trying to figure out why I felt different. And it's not just one-dimensional, right? So clearly growing up, very young age, I knew that I was gay. I didn't like boys. I like girls. Very simply, that's the way my brain processed it. And then you recognize that you're different for a number of other reasons as well. You're different because you might not be from that part of the country. You might not speak that language. You're different because, I'm Christian, and maybe, at one point in time I was working in a state that was predominantly Muslim. You're different because maybe you learned how to speak English differently, so you sound different. Mm-hmm. I have it's not really a British accent, it's just a strange accent when I speak, right? And then interests drive difference. When we're in school, you like sports, for example, right? And here's where it's interesting. I didn't like sports. Well, actually, even if I did like sports, I wasn't good at them, right? Mm-hmm. So I didn't like sports. And for some reason, I thought everybody else did. And so I felt different.
Yeah.
Ignoring the many students who, like me, didn't like sports either. But because sports was celebrated, it became the dominant interest. And if you didn't like it, rather than seek community with students like you like me, who might enjoy reading or who might enjoy theater, we sat around just simply feeling different.
Yep. And that's one of the reasons why authenticity is big for me. That's why I preach authenticity. Because what I realized is, even the sports, I went into sports because I was skinny, very, very, very thin with long legs, and everybody kept saying, oh, you should run. And I realized, okay. And then when I started running and winning state level, I was like a rock star. Ondo State, I was a rock star. People applauded me. Everybody wanted to be my friend. Now, flip that. I grew up with my father, who does construction, who owned a fishing trailer and things like that. I like to work with my hands, right? And you like to read books. I love reading as well, but I have dyslexia. So you could read a book in 30 minutes. I've watched you do it. It takes me maybe like 3 days. Because not only do I have to read it once, I have to read it twice, right? And so you have me having dyslexia, you have me being gay, you have me, a child whose mother left, a one. There's so many things that makes us different. And then the more isolated we become because we grew up in a society where hush-hush was the motto. You don't tell your dirty laundry, you don't talk about things. People don't understand how important it is to share their stories, because then it makes me, who felt, imagine if I had known, very often I come to you and I said, I wish we had met earlier. And we had many opportunities, but I was in the closet. Imagine if I had been out act, or if I knew another woman that was Nigerian, because we were told Africans were not gay, right? So imagine if I had seen another woman who was professional, not even professional, who was just living her life, just one. Life would have been so much easier. Because a lot of times we become so isolated, believing that we're by ourselves. Even something as simple as my father having a lot of wives, I thought he was the only one. Because you remember in those days, you're not supposed to have a lot of wives, because if you're educated, you're not supposed to have a lot of wives. You know, the uneducated people, and I'm putting up my fingers here because I believe education is not just formal, but being different, if we just could talk, you know. It was amazing when I came out and all these people were coming to me saying, I came out on Facebook. I came out to myself first. Took a few years to come out, really. But if we could only just share our stories, we would save a lot of people a lot of pain.
I think storytelling, I do agree with you, storytelling is really powerful, right? We learn about other people, and I find that learning about other people builds my sense of empathy. And you mentioned much earlier in this conversation, you talked about having, quote unquote, house girls and house boys. And I want to go back to that phenomenon. Because that's actually a colonial term that was introduced, right? And if you think about it, there've always been extended families in Nigeria. A nuclear family, they're fairly wealthy. They will usually have a relative who comes from a less wealthy family come live with them, and they will educate that relative. And other people actually had maids, right? So there was that whole culture going on where you would have maids. The terms differed. Sometimes they were just younger relatives. But like you, I grew up in a house where my parents were responsible. In our case, they were more likely to be younger relatives from my father's family or my mother's family, who my parents were now taking financial responsibility for. And here's where I'm going with this. We all grew up together. That's another sense of difference, right? Because at that young age, I couldn't quite process the subtle and sometimes obvious signals you see in your home that tell you there is a difference between that child and you. And it didn't make a lot of sense to me because we were friends. Many times we felt like sisters or brothers, but then something would happen, either your birthday or their birthday, and you would get like this supersonic gift, and they might get nothing, and you begin to see that there's a difference.
Yeah.
And for me, you know, that's where my empathy started. And I remember I would ask questions of my parents and very quickly be shut down because maybe they felt you were too young to understand the nuances.
Yeah.
But I say that to say there's something about being different. We talked about people pleasing, we talked about pandering, but I think there's also something about being different that has helped me be more empathetic to others. And very quickly, I'm able to put myself in others' shoes and see the situation through their eyes.
Yes, yes.
Because I had to do that a lot for myself as a child who felt different growing up. Does that resonate with you?
Of course. I remember so many times. I remember my dad used to call me a terrorist, right? Because I couldn't understand why my pocket money was twice as much as the people that were working on the property, working on the land, and they lived in the boys' quarters, and I lived in the front of the house in a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom house. And this young people, sometimes with their parents, very rarely with their parents, you know, they all lived in the back. I remember their food always tasted better than ours. I don't know why. So instead of me eating in our side of the house, I would go hang out in the boys' quarters. I remember spending a lot of my money, buying them stuff, buying them clothing, and I felt more comfortable with them than with my siblings. Because my siblings, and I've always hung out with the underdog. My cousins used to laugh at me because I would rather hang out with the houseboy and the housegirl. There was nothing pretentious about them. And I even now hate the word houseboy or housegirl because they're not, house, whatever. They're maybe helpers, but they all came to us. So my father would send them to school. Parents would just drop off their child from the villages, and it was crazy. I lived in what felt like a circus, right? But yet, the best memories I have were with those people. And I put up my fingers. Those people, nothing pretentious about them. Once they felt comfortable enough with me, they treated me like one of them. They would cook and save me food. So, yeah.
And they must have felt very different too.
I can imagine.
And I think in a way, because I remember saying to my mother, I just like food that was very spicy as well. And the two young girls who lived with us, Julie and Kende, they made a lot of spicy food. And I remember saying to my mother, I'm not eating with you anymore. I'm going to eat with them, right? And it's amazing how welcoming they were, right? And I think sometimes what bound us both were differences.
Yeah.
They felt different. We felt different.
Yeah.
And as I sit here today, I'm just so grateful for the ability to reflect on some of this. Mm-hmm. We've used terms that we haven't used since our childhood. Relics of colonialism.
Yes.
Things like house girls, house boys, boys' quarters.
Today you'll be cancelled.
I'm so grateful that we're in a time where we're able to reflect on language.
Yes.
And I see Nigeria moving away from those models towards models of clarity. If you have I'm glad that we still retain the heart to help. Some of us still retain the heart to help relatives and friends who may be less fortunate.
And even strangers.
Because
that was a culture then, wasn't it?
Right. Without having to make them feel different, without having to label them.
Yes.
And I think one of the reasons why we are so passionate about what we do is because we grew up different.
Yes.
Because we grew up feeling different.
Yes.
I want to ask you how that difference felt when you realized you were gay.
Oh, God. It was a very scary moment, honestly, because I walked around different. I walked around with a sense of shame on many levels, right? But yet here I was, I am, high-flying in real estate, right? Our words coming out of the wall, but I still didn't feel right. Went to church 5 days a week, still didn't feel right, And the day I finally looked in the mirror, because I think I ran into somebody and I felt that attraction. And then I went home and I started to read books on being gay, being a lesbian and all that stuff. And I walked in the mirror. I walked to the bathroom, stood in front of the mirror, and I just sobbed. Because in 2003, it wasn't cool to be gay. Are you kidding me? People were still getting beaten up on the streets, and, black churches are, even in 2023, some of the coldest places to be. And I just cried. And I was afraid, because I had built this whole world of powerful, black, heterosexual, strong woman, and at that point I'd been separated anyways. But I looked at myself and I thinking, how am I going to make it in this world as a gay person? And I'm Nigerian. There's no other gay person there's no other Nigerian gay person that I knew at that point, or lesbian, I should say, right? It was a very scary place to be. And yours?
So it's interesting that in your response, You have said the word fear in many different ways.
Oh, yeah.
You said fear, you've said afraid, you've said scary. And it's interesting that books come up. You said you read.
Yeah.
I remember for me, I remember I was about 8 years old when I began to realize I was different. I used to buy a book a week, save up my pocket money, and every week I'd buy a book. I loved to read about experiences in boarding schools in England. I was in Nigeria. And so this day I came across this book and I bought it, and it was a book about a boarding school. And I began to read the book. And I didn't realize the book was about a young man who found out he was gay in boarding school. They didn't use the word gay once in the book, didn't use the word homosexual once in the book, but you could tell. And as I read the book, I was glued to it the whole day. I realized that's what I am. It was a very clean book. There were no physical experiences. He was just writing about what he felt. And I realized that's what I am. What I felt at that moment was, first, a sense of relief, because now I know that this thing I felt about myself was real. There was somebody else, might be a book, that feels this way. And then I realized from reading the book that it was not a good thing to be. He was afraid. And now I was afraid. He was ashamed. And I was ashamed. So here I was on a Saturday morning. I had found out that what I was feeling was real, but that it was also something to be ashamed of and afraid of. And there was no one I could speak to about it.
That was the hardest part.
But at the end of the day, you and I often say, Moji, that we all have a journey for a reason.
Yes.
So real quickly before we leave, what is the message that you would leave today for people who feel different?
The message I would leave for people who feel different is to explore. We live in a very, very modern world where we have computers, the internet, research, listen to podcasts, go to other channels and do research. Find community. Because that was for me, if I had found a community, my sufferings wouldn't be that much. I would not have turned myself into what I now know is a panderer. It bleeds into everything that we do. So lean in. It's okay. You're not the only one.
Lean in, it's okay, you're not the only one. What I would say is pretty similar to that. And the question, people are feeling different for many different reasons. It might be because you're gay, might be because you're black, might be because you're white, might be for any reason. Here's what I would say. There's really nothing like difference. Because to label yourself different means that you are saying that there's something somewhere else that is the norm. I say embrace yourself. Same way you said lean in. Embrace yourself, your nuances, your characteristics, your attributes. It's all you. It's what makes you unique. And when you do embrace yourself, then learn about yourself and seek community so that every nuance, every attribute, every piece of you is nurtured by one community or the other.
Yes.
It's another day, Moji, another conversation. It's been great.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for listening in to the Solar Wilson Conversation, where we share our views through the lens of a Nigerian, lesbian, legally married couple. So signing off, I am Margaret Solar Wilson.
And I am Moji Solar Wilson.
And as usual, we leave you with our message. Be authentic. Your voice is unique and your words are truth. Your story is powerful. Never, ever be afraid to share your unique perspective and story with the world. Your story will touch someone. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.